Hello. So now let's go ahead and start implementing. We are still in iteration number 2, and our scope is to create one view, one picker view that displays the list of units that we wanted to use. And the list of our solution implementation, we set up the project. So let's go ahead and do that step. So we open Xcode, create a new Xcode project, and we'll use the single view application. Next, we provide the product name, your last name underscore unit converter. Doesn't really have to use your last name unless you are in my class, then you have to do that. And the rest of the steps will be the same as before, and Xcode will remember it. So we're using Swift as the language, devices is iPhone, no core data. And then next, you see where you want to save the project. So it goes to the folder. Uncheck the get unless you're really using it, and then say create. Notice that this folder is your project. All your entire project is in this folder. So whenever you want to move your project from one the computer to the other, or email it or submit it in the class, you need to zip or compress or archive this folder. That's what I need you to do. And then, oops, I said click cancel, and then create. So a project is created following the single view application template, and the single view application template is good. It provides us with a view already there, and it provides us with a controller that is connected to this view. If you select the view controller from the storyboard and go to the identity inspector, you will see under custom class, you will see the name of the view controller.swift file, view controller.swift. That tells you that your app view is controlled by a custom class. If you click on the view controller, you see here the keyword class. This is a class, but it is a user class. Us, we developed this. It's not from the library. This is a library class, and this is our own class. But as we mentioned before, we do not create our class from scratch. We create it based upon or built upon, so this column, meaning that our class is based upon the library class. That's what allows us to have access to these lifecycle methods that are available in the library class, and more, not just these, others as well. So we set up the project. And one thing that we're going to do here in the view, if you go down, we'll change that setting to be a compact setting. So width compact and height any. So make that setting and keep it for all the project that we have. So that's, I believe, is step number 1. So we come here and we can check this is done. And then we go again, create a resource file with the units that we want. We did this before. You can right click on the project name and say new file. You can also go from the Xcode menu to file and then new. We'll go to resource, and we'll use the property list file to enter our information. It will tell you what do you want to save it as. So we're going to call this units list. Or you can name it anything you want, but if you name it differently, notice that I'm going to use that name in the code. So if you named it differently, then use your own name. Then the group is what you can see here in the project navigation, so you can decide where the file will be. I'll keep everything together under this one group and say create. So here's our property list. We used it before in project 1 and module 1. So there's a key and a value and a type. There are 2 types at the root level, an array or a dictionary. And the difference between them is that the array is an indexed list, the dictionary is a named list. And I'm going to use an array now. And as I mentioned later on, I'll see if we switch this to a dictionary, how we can use the same app. It will be a little bit different. But we'll add the unit. So here the array, since it's indexed, the first item is 0. And the unit types in the model from iteration 1, we're going to use a string. And then we said we're using feet. I'm going to put them in order. So I'll say inch. Then another one, I'll say feet. And then mile, and then the meter, and then finally the kilometer. So these are the 5 units that we have in our scope, and I added them in a list file and I named it units list. So that takes care of that step. So that step also is done. Then implement the viewDidLoad to load the units to an array. So the viewDidLoad is here in the view controller. Here is the viewDidLoad, which is the life cycle method that is notified by the operating system the moment the view loads in the app. So here we're going to load the units from the file into an array. So in order to do this, we need to get a reference to the app bundle. And we've done that in project 1. The app loads into your device and it has a bundle or a folder that it has access to where all the files that you load in the project goes into. So we need to get a reference to that bundle. And the reference, we get it from a library called NSBundle. So we call the library NSBundle. And one of the functions in that library is the main bundle. So we say give us the main bundle. And the main bundle returns back where the bundle is. So we assign that bundle using the let keyword. And we're using let because it's not going to change. I'm not going to change that. And give it a name, app bundle. I can define the type, or Swift will figure the type from the assignment. Since the right is NSBundle, the left will also be NSBundle. Then we need to get a reference to the path of the file that has the units. Where do I get that? From the app bundle. So I say app bundle dot resource, or not resource, path for resource. We used that before in project number 1, which requires 2 pieces of information. The first one is a string representing the name of the file, and the second one is a string representing the extension. So to enter a string, we use double quotations, and the name is units list, and I got that from here. See, this is the name, whatever before the dot, and the plist is the extension. So hit the tab to go to the second one, and again it's a string, so I use double quotation and enter the type, plist. Unit list, units list, plist. It's case sensitive, has to be exactly the same as it is here. Then what this will give you is a string representing the file path. So let's say let file path equal that stuff. The third step is to load the content of the file into an NS array. Now this NS array needs to be created in memory. If I create the NS array here, let's say let units, something like that, NS array. If I do something like that, I'll be defining the units inside this block, which is the viewDidLoad or the function block. Anything that you define, meaning that you use let or var on within a particular block, will live and die inside the block. We call this the scope of the life of the variable. So this units, if I define it here, will only be accessible inside this block. But I know from my solution formulation that this array will have the count of items in the Pickle View. It will have the content of the item in the Pickle View. So I'm going to need to access that array, if you recall here, from other functions. I'm going to need to access the array from the number of rows and the title for row, not just from the viewDidLoad function. So in order to make this array accessible outside the viewDidLoad, I need to define it in a bigger scope, which is the class scope. So I come in the class scope and say let units, give it the name and I need to give it a type, NSArray, like that. And since this unit may not have a value, or what we call the optional type, then we end it with an exclamation mark at the end, so that we say that we are doing the what's called optional binding, that we are binding it with the array. So now we define the units as an array inside the class scope. Since I define it, you see here I have an error, because once you define something you can't redefine it, but you can use it. So I can say units equal. So now units, which I defined over there, I'm gonna assign something in it. Whoa, I just realized you're gonna assign something to it. This means that you're gonna change its content. So I can't use let, so I use var. Var means that the content will change. You can assign something to it as you go. So then I'll make it as var, so I'm able to make that assignment. So what do I want to assign to it? I want to assign the content of the file. So I use the NSArray library initializer. So the parentheses gives us access to the different initializers of the NSArray. One of them is you initialize the array with a content of file, and all what it needs is a string representing the path of the file that has the array. So I'll say I want to use this initializer, provide the path as a string, but I already have the path as a file, as a variable. So if I have the path as a variable, I don't need to provide it as a string. I just type the variable name. So the variable name is a string, and I provide the variable name as a path to this array. And what is saying here that the optional type string is not unwrapped. So what I can do is come at the end of this and put an exclamation mark here, and that will say that I want you to bind the string variable with the path for the resource at that initial step, so I don't have to worry about it here. These are exactly the same steps that we did in project number 1 to load the codes from the file into an array. So that's this step here. We are done with it. So this is 1, 2 is done. And make an array, the controller. So now make the controller able to be a data source and a Pickle View. Now, our view controller is based upon the UI view controller library. In addition to the UI view controller library, we want our class to be also capable of behaving as a Pickle View data source and a Pickle View delegate. To do that, we add a comma and put the name of the protocols that we want our class to abide by. So there's a Pickle View, so start typing UI Pickle View, and there's a Pickle View data source. So we're saying here that our class is built upon the UI view controller and is certified, is capable of behaving as a UI Pickle View data source, comma, UI Pickle View delegate. By adding these controls in the protocols in the comma separated list, our class became eligible or certified to behave as a data source and a Pickle View. What does this mean? It means what you see to the left, that the compiler will force you to provide definitions for these 3 required methods: number of components, number of rows, and title for row. And we will get to that when we get to it, but for now you will see an error here, and if you click on the error, it says that the view controller claims to be a data source, but it does not conform to it. Why it does not conform? Because until now we have not provided definitions for this method. We did not do implementation like we did here. We implemented view.load, we implemented this, but we didn't do the other one. We're gonna do that later. So that's this step. So we made our class capable of being a data source and a Pickle View. The next step is to add the Pickle View to our view. So I come to the storyboard and go to a Pickle View. So look here for a Pickle View. Here it is, a Pickle View. And the Pickle View is a library called UI Pickle View. And you can drag that Pickle View here, and it comes with the entire width, and you can specify, you can change the width. So I'm going to change it a little bit. The reason for that is I know I'm going to put another one next to it. Go back to iteration number 1. We said this is how we're going to lay out our application. And if you forgot that, you can see it if we go back here. We said we're going to put a Pickle View for the units from, one for the unit 2. So I'm doing just that. So we added the Pickle View. Then the next step is to connect the Pickle View to the controller as a data source and a delegate. There are multiple ways to do this. This icon here in the storyboard, the yellow circle, is a representation of what the controller class is. If you right click, it will tell you everything inside it. So if you have any connections, it will go inside here. If I want to connect that Pickle View to the controller, I can press the control key, drag from the Pickle View to the controller icon, and release at the controller icon. And it says here, the controller can be a data source and can be a delegate. What would you like? I want it both. So I'll first say I want it to be a data source. Then you select it again and say I want it to be a delegate. Then you can right click to make sure that it worked well. So here it says the controller has 2 outlets. Both of them link to this Pickle View, one of them as a data source and one of them as a delegate. So that tells you that you made the connection correct and that the connection is actually in the controller right now. So that's this step. Then the last step is to implement the 3 methods that give you the data that you need. Before I do that, I want to show you the documentation and API so that you can take a look at those methods. And perhaps this could be a good resource for research whenever we introduce a new component. So if I say UI Pickle View and go to it, it gives you the documentation page of the UI Pickle View. On the right side are details, and the left is kind of table of content, what's inside it. So in the top part, it tells you what the name and what is the relationship with other library. So it inherits from, meaning that UI Pickle View has a column to UI View, which in turn has a column to UI Responder, which in turn has one to the NS object. It's meaning that it is built upon all of these. Conforms to, meaning that it has been certified to behave as those protocols. So it abides by those protocols, all of these ones. Give you a description here and then give you details. So the UI Pickle View has a property called number of components, can tell you about itself, can tell you how many components it has, how many row sizes. It can reload the component, all of them. It can reload a specific one. It can select, it can give you the selected row. It can give you the view for a particular row. It can give you who's the data source, and it can give you who is shows the selection indicator, and it can give you who is the delegate. If you go to the data source, you'll see that this is of the type UI Pickle View data source. And if we click on it, go to the data source protocol, which give you the number of components in the Pickle View and the number of rows. These are the 2 methods, number of components and number of rows. So the PickerView the data source responsibilities is to tell the PickerView how many components it has and how many rows it has. If you go to the delegate, the delegate has more responsibilities. It can specify the row height, it can specify the width, it sets the title or attributed title or a view. The difference is on each row you can put a title, which is basically a label, which a label has text, and you can also do attributed title or attributed label, which means that you can have some styling for the fonts, or you can do a view. What is the difference? The view is like this rectangle area that we used in module 2 to paint upon, which means you can add an image to the view, you can add any other component, you can add it on a view and then make that view a row. So if you want to have a more complex list, you can make it as a view. As a view instead of a title. It also has a method that tells you did select row. Once the user selects a row, this method is notified. It's a life cycle method or a function, and we're going to use that in the extra credit in order to perform the conversion once the user makes a selection. So now that we know about them, let's go ahead and implement all of them. So this is the module for the view did load, and I don't need it, so I'm just going to close it so we don't get confused. And I'm also going to close or fold the did receive a memory warning. I'd like you to remember that picture. You have one block which belongs to the class. Then inside the class you have variables and you have functions. Every function has its own block. When you make a variable inside the class block, you can use it inside any of the functions. If you make it inside the function, you can only use it inside that function. So we have 3 functions that we need to implement. And I don't know exactly how to type them, so I'm just going to rely on Xcode to help me. So the first one is number of components. So start typing number. Because we made this class capable of being a data source and a delegate, these methods show up. So number of components show up. And it is a function that gives you back an integer, and it receives a picker view. So if you have more than one picker view, the operating system notifies this function and say, picker view X, give me how many components. Picker view Y, give me how many components. Here we gonna have 2 picker views, but both of them will display the same thing, so it doesn't matter. In this function, we want to provide it with an integer value, which means a number that is not decimal, that represents how many components. To provide a number, we say return. The return is a keyword that takes an expression or a data and sends it back to whoever called this function, which will be the operating system. So the operating system will attempt to load the picker view. Then it will recognize that it needs to go to the delegate, so it will come to this class because it's going to need to go to the data source first. So comes to this class because it's a data source, and will look for this function and say, give me a number so I can construct the components. Say we want only one component, so give the number 1. Then the second one is the number of rows, but this one, if you remember in the picker view, it has the picker view name first. So we say picker view, and then here they are, the number of rows, the title for row, and the number of rows needs an integer to describe how many rows in the picker view, in a component in the picker view, and the title needs a string. So we'll choose this one. And as it is, it says here that this is a function. The name of the function is PickerView. Inside it, there are some parameters. One of the parameters is number of rows in components, which is a function. And it receives a component and give you back an integer. So we'll say here, where do we get that integer? That integer number of rows in component, it receives a component. So the integer here need to represent how many rows in your component. So how many rows? I need as many rows in the picker view as I have units. So how do I know the number of units? I loaded the units into this array, and the array knows its count. So I can say return and go to the array which is called units and say give me how many you have. See, the count function or the count property inside the units array has and returns or is an integer type similar to this, a non-decimal number representing the number of objects in that array. So I can pass that number as the number of rows in the component. The last function also starts with PickerView, and it is title for row. And this function needs a string. So it says, it brings you a PickerView and says for this particular row, so it gives you an integer representing the row, and it gives you also an integer to represent the component. In our case, I only have one component, so I can ignore that. If you had more than one component, then you can use that component number to switch between the component data sources. For the title, it gives you the index. If I want to take the units as they are in the array and display them, meaning that at the same index. Remember when we created the unit in a list, it has index 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. The rows in the picker view are like that. There's row number 1, or the first row is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So I can just display them like that. It means I can take the row index in the picker view and use it as the array index to retrieve a string representing the unit that I want to display. So in the return, I can say in the return, I can return units, go to the array and say, give me your object at index. Object at index returns a generic type called any object, but it needs an index. I will use the row as the index. So I'll use the row as the index. But because object at index give me any index, I can say give me this as a string. So I say return the object at index at this particular row. I'm calling the function object at index to give me whatever unit at this particular number, and I want it as the type string. So I'm using as a string to change the type from the any object which it gives you to specifically string. This works well because I know that the array has a string. This is how I specified it. If you specified something else here, then you will have to use a different type in here. So this is gives us the last step, and I implemented that. So I am done. Well, yes you are, and yes you're not. You will be done once you do the testing. Because we started by saying there's a scope and we defined the test. So what is the test? Well, now we need to run the test scenario. So the test scenario are two steps. You load the app and you should see the list of units displayed in the picker view. If we do, then the test is correct and we achieved the scope and we're good. If we didn't, then the test has failed. So let's load the app by running the project, and this will build the app, and if there are any errors it will tell us, and then opens the simulator, and the simulator will load the app, and the first thing in the app is the view. We only have one view, so it will load the view, and which will trigger view did load, then it will trigger the number of components, then it will trigger the number of row, then it will trigger the title for row. And if it triggered all of them correctly, we should see the list of units are there in the picker view in the same order. And here is my list. And here it is. The first one is the first, the second, the third, the fourth, and the fifth. So this means that our test has succeeded. And this is success, big success. And we have our iteration number 2 working. So we can go here and check on iteration 2. And in the next video, we'll do iteration 3 where we add the second picker view.